engineering degree. Now I'm pursuing a civil engineering degree and thrive in hands-on roles. I work as an undergrad engineer with a civil construction company and contribute to the naval shipyards at Osborne, expanding my technical expertise. I am very passionate about sustainability and equality and have advocated for regional students through my involvement in the SA Youth Forum. As a STEM ambassador for Flinders University, I promote careers in science and engineering, focusing on supporting disadvantaged groups and encouraging women in STEM, helping to break barriers and create opportunities in the field. Today, it is my pleasure to acknowledge Councillor Jan Clifford, OAM, NRWC President Leonie Noble, NRWC Ambassador Joe Stewart-Rattray, NRWC Ambassador, and welcome our special guest, Claire Gibellini, who represents Women with Disabilities Australia and is in New York as a civil society delegation. Thank you to everyone that has taken the time to join us today. We will now do an acknowledgement of country. This is how people across Australia show awareness and respect for the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are meeting. It is a way to acknowledge the exclusion, discrimination, and oppression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and recognise their continuing connection to land. An acknowledgement of country is important to all Australians as it allows us to give respect to country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the countries of Australia. We recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have enduring connection to country and culture and that the land was never ceded. With this acknowledgement, we respect the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, from the thriving culture thousands of years ago to the more recent and harmful history of colonisation. We recognise the enduring impacts colonisation has had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We, the National Rural Women's Coalition, is formed by women of many backgrounds, including First Nations, and meet many Aboriginal nations across Australia and its territories. We look forward to a brighter future where we walk alongside our First Nations people and deeply learn as they share with us their knowledge from their ancestors. We learn, benefit, and thrive when we join together as empowered women and from the elders' ancestral knowledge. And we endeavour to honour Aboriginal women in guiding and teaching us on better ways for women, girls, and all people. The National Rural Women's Coalition, or NRWC, is funded as part of the National Women's Alliance by the Australian Federal Government. It is one of 5 organisations that are focused on women's development. The Women's Alliance is made up of the following: Working with Women Alliance, National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, National Rural Women's Coalition, Women with Disabilities Australia, and Multicultural Australia Women's Alliance. The NRWC is focused on ensuring regional, rural, remote, and very remote women's voices are represented when developing policy across all levels. We know rural women come from all backgrounds, from agriculture and seafood through to small business owners, care workers, and carers. The Young Rural Regional Remote Women's Advocacy Panel works on projects that are important to rural, regional, remote young Australian women and provide grassroots advice on emerging issues to the National Rural Women's Coalition Secretary and Board. Meeting monthly, the group provides young women's perspectives to the work and advocacy of the National Rural Women's Coalition and supports communities and advocacy initiatives. This advocacy panel is provided with leadership opportunities through the work of the coalition. This is a dynamic group and suits women with strong commitment to thriving rural, regional, and remote communities. So I'd like to give you a bit of an idea of where rural women live in Australia. They live on 95% of the landmass, but are only 31% of the population. So although this map looks small, Australia is actually the 6th largest country in the world with a population of 26 million. The experiences rural women and girls changes as the distance between towns and villages increases. The further you move from the coast, particularly in the east, the further a rural woman is from services that she may need, such as hospitals, schools, food stores, police, public transport, and places of worship. The young rural regional remote advocacy panel members come from across Australia from a variety of backgrounds and diverse geographical locations. This map shows you where each of our panel members presenting today are located. As shown, Sarah and Claire are located in Western Australia, Hayley, Phoebe, and Natalie are located in New South Wales, and I'm located here in South Australia. I will now introduce some valued members of the Young Rural Regional Remote Women's Advocacy Panel. Natalie is a passionate advocate for diversity and innovation in agriculture. Nat has an honours degree in agricultural science. She is committed to driving continuous improvement and fostering participation across the industry. In 2024, Natalie was recognised as an Evoke Ag Future Young Leader after founding a startup dedicated to reducing plastic waste in the livestock industry. Currently working as a business analyst, Natalie enhances the efficiency of high-value agricultural assets in the northern beef industry. She is dedicated to amplifying the voices of rural women and believes in the power of networking across industries to build a more adaptive and inclusive agricultural sector. Hayley hails from Gunnedah in northwest New South Wales, where her love for agriculture came from. Hayley has a Bachelor of Agriculture and has worked in varying roles in agriculture, agronomy, rural event coordination, student recruitment, and currently works for the program attracting students to careers within the agricultural industry. She is incredibly passionate about the future of Australian agriculture and the role rural women play in it. She hopes to help provide opportunities for more women in remote, rural, and regional areas. Claire is the Deputy Chair for the WA Ministerial Advisory Council on Disability. Claire serves on multiple boards and steering committees focused on improving outcomes for people with disability and is a passionate human rights campaigner both in Australia and internationally. Phoebe is an internationally recognised founder and advisor driving transformative change in education, gender equality, and civic engagement. As CEO of Inspire Tomorrow Education, she uses technology to provide free tutoring and scholarship access to underserved communities, impacting hundreds of students nationwide. Selected as a Women to Watch Young Trade Leader, Phoebe amplifies Asia-Pacific voices in global trade, focusing on gender and regional equity. She has advised on youth governance and human rights as a board director at Voices of Influence Australia and as an OECD YouthWise advisory member. Phoebe also founded the 100 Future Leader by the AFR. Sarah was born and raised in the country. In 2020, after completing her degree in criminal justice, Sarah moved to remote Australia to work as a domestic violence caseworker. This allows Sarah to focus on her two passions in life: rural, remote, and regional communities, and women's safety. We will now get into the presentations. So first off, we have Natalie.
Thanks very much, Lauren. So let me tell you the story of a rural woman. Her journey began in Sydney, growing up with no rural background or experience. Her high school taught agriculture and had a small hobby farm, which was the place that ignited her love of livestock. She lived 5 minutes from a supermarket, had access to crystal clear phone service and reliable internet 24/7. Her university, where she was studying agricultural science, was in a major city, an hour and a half commute away from her home, and there was countless large corporate businesses either headquartered or occupying offices in that major city, many of whom were starting to market roles for women studying sciences, technology, or engineering. She went to women's luncheons and conferences hosted by these businesses that were conveying how sought after women studying science were, and that the corporate world was their oyster. She was filled with hope and anticipation for what her career may look like once she finished her degree. It wasn't the skyscraper landscape of the city or the hustle and bustle routine that drew her in. It was the structure of opportunity, being part of a large organisation that had many minds working together, contributing to something bigger than themselves. The opportunity to work her way up a ladder. And now I know this young woman well because this is my story. And it's how I imagined how my career could be. A 900-kilometre flight away from Sydney with a 20-kilo suitcase was how I started my career in ag. My first job was out in the field. Next slide, please, Lauren. Thanks. I loved it. Being outside every day, experiencing the camaraderie within a rural community, and being far removed from the hustle of city life. Minimal traffic, free parking, and no lining up for clubs and restaurants. But living rurally wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Some things were more expensive. Phone service was patchy. And when it came time a few years on to explore my next career move, the big corporate businesses who told me a few years earlier that they couldn't wait to hire me were only really interested in employees living in the city. The challenge starts with the rigid way that these roles are structured. Everyone in the office, located in a major city, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We see it depicted in the media. A quick Google image search of the term Australian business returns countless photos of suits, boardroom handshakes, skyscrapers, links to register new businesses. But what do you think the search term rural Australian business looks like? Predominantly farming related, ads for business support and recruitment, articles about doing it tough. This is just one of many nuanced ways which communicate to us that corporate businesses and rural Australia are not considered to be aligned, signalling that opportunity and financial abundance is confined to a city. This is mirrored in the traditional structure of jobs within corporate Australia that are limited to metro-based employees. In the months between 2023 and 2024, Australian agriculture exported $71.5 billion worth of goods and services. Now, that's not a small number, and definitely not one that deserves to be depicted in the media as an industry struggling to survive. Australian farmers are stewards for over 50% of our country's landmass. In 2021, 81% of Australia's agricultural workforce lived in regional areas. But I wonder if that's a function of being located where they work, or because they didn't have a chance to work for a metro-based business due to the ways that roles are structured. Imagine if these corporate roles weren't largely limited to employees who are metro-based. Do you think we could theorise what that could look like? We don't have to. We've already seen it with the huge disruptions to workplace structure during the COVID pandemic. Cities turned into ghost people living in capital cities, 1 in 4 reported working from home during COVID, compared to 1 in 8 people living outside of capital cities. Perhaps rural women may not have had the chance to work from home because they weren't working in these type of roles to begin with. Unfortunately, I've seen firsthand the impact of businesses moving away from a rural area. I was working in sales and marketing, based rurally, and in an office which was 60% female. Our office was relocated to a capital city over 300 kilometres away, along with our jobs. So we faced the decision, unfortunately common amongst rural women: prioritise our lifestyle, family, and community, or move to this major city and prioritise our career. All of us chose to forego our positions to stay rural, and luckily for our town, it kept 7 professionally skilled women. There are many women like us who are talented and skilled for a corporate role who would be incredible assets to a large business, if only the roles enabled flexibility to live and support a rural community. We've proved during COVID that businesses can operate successfully without staff being in the metropolitan office. So, what else besides the role structure is preventing this rhetoric being adopted to enable rural women to engage in a corporate role remotely? The lack of access to childcare has a huge impact on a rural woman's ability to raise a family as well as contribute to the economy. Closures of childcare centres and family daycare have been occurring for years, unfortunately, leading to many women being unable to work. 2018 saw the closure of 7 childcare services across a large footprint of our region. And this issue is widespread and in no way limited to the Riverina, where I'm based. Other regions nearby have found that only half of their towns with a population below 5,000 people had accessible long day care. Our state has some of the strictest staff to child ratio rules that require a minimum number of educators to hold tertiary qualifications. Last year, 11% of childcare centres applied for a waiver to reduce this after they couldn't provide enough staff to meet these requirements. Conversely, only 3% of metro centres applied for the same waiver. Some families have travelled up to 60 kilometres away just to find alternative childcare when centres have closed, or are considering sacrificing their life in rural Australia to move to a city just to source the childcare. Research has indicated that rural families are facing these issues disproportionately to metro families, who in some instances have reported a glut of childcare supply. The second major challenge to a rural woman's access to remote corporate employment is the unreliable access to both mobile service and internet faced by many communities. Our country has historically had coverage issues across rural Australia. In 3 years between 2021 and 2024, rural Australians submitted complaints about faults and poor service quality over 51,000 times. There's no equity in the lack of reliable mobile coverage and connectivity. You'll see from the coverage map on the next slide that one of Australia's largest telco providers, which this map has been sourced from, can provide internet access for some rural residents in New South Wales, being 4G at best. Such a large portion of our state relies on satellite services, whose efficacy is often negatively influenced by the weather. Now, I work as a business analyst, which could definitely be considered a corporate job. And although being based in southern New South Wales, most of my colleagues are actually located in rural Queensland. Next slide, please, Lauren. And some of them are 2,500 kilometres away. I have access to reliable internet and mobile service. And without this connectivity, I wouldn't be able to perform my job. I want to see a future where all rural women have the opportunity to engage in a remote role because they too have connectivity and access. We know that a constrained access to childcare and reliable mobile coverage impede a rural woman's ability to contribute to the workforce, which may not even be possible if corporate roles aren't structured to consider their geography in the first place. So why should corporate Australia support a shift, and what can we do about it? Well, increased productivity is up for grabs. Research shows that there is a strong relationship between an increase in the number of women in key decision-making positions and subsequent improvements in company performance. If labour force participation gap was halved between men and women, Australia's GDP would increase by $60 billion in 20 years. Increasing female representation on boards and governing bodies has indicated to increase company value between $52 and $70 million a year. A survey conducted by the National Rural Women's Coalition showed that 84% of rural women surveyed had education and qualifications beyond school. We're qualified and skilled, prime candidates to excel in corporate roles that require a tertiary education. In a recruitment market where diversity is commonly prioritised, what better way to increase the diversity of a talent pool than by looking to rural women? We are well equipped with a multitude of soft skills that will benefit corporate Australia. When I think of the women in my community, I think of resilience. juggling the balance of family, community, work, and travelling long distances to access essential services like healthcare. Targeted government support to upskill childcare employees with a tertiary qualification could mitigate centre closures due to the lack of available tertiary educated staff. Programs are being delivered by the state government that develop the leadership and professional skills of rural women, which is a great initiative. But I see the next step to support this is for corporate Australia to offer roles that rural women can participate in remotely to capitalise on these amazing leadership skills. As someone who grew up in a city, I know the privilege of having access to mobile and internet coverage, and the close proximity to employment and the opportunities that these could bring. So let's work with big businesses to rebrand the perception of rural Australia so that in the future, economic opportunity is associated with our communities. And I don't have to generate images like this using AI. When barriers to participating in the workforce are removed and corporate roles are structured to remove geographical biases, rural women will not only boost the economy, but be able to have both a rural life and a corporate career. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening at the end of my presentation. And now I would like to pass over to...
Thank you, Nat. Good morning, everybody. In my career as a rural woman, every CEO, the majority of managers, and the people in leadership roles mentoring me have been men. I recently walked into a new role and was met by a male manager, a male business lead, several male agronomists, and a male CEO. Why is it that females aren't holding these roles? All I hope for when I start in a new company is that there will be a woman I can look to as a role model, that a woman will be the CEO, that a woman stood where I was and hope for the same thing I do, to be in power and to be a part of the decision thinking. My chest hurts thinking about it, and I feel so frustrated that we have come so far, yet have so much further to go. When will women have the opportunity to be in power in our rural communities? Women have always played a critical role in rural, remote and regional Australia, from running farms and businesses to leading community initiatives. Over time, we have slowly seen an increase in female representation in local councils, industry groups, and agricultural leadership in particular. Programs supporting women's leadership development, mentorship, and networking have also grown, helping break down barriers that once seemed insurmountable. However, while there is some progress, true equality in decision-making is still ongoing. Many women continue to face cultural, social, and structural challenges that limit their influence in key areas. Were you aware that women make up 32% of the agricultural workforce in Australia, but they only make up 23% of leadership roles? While women in Australia make up half of all employees, women only comprise of 19.4% of all CEOs, 32.5% of key management positions, 33% of board members, and 18% of board chairs. Reports from the WGEA 2018 and 19 report highlight how critical leadership roles are in driving towards change. Women are progressing into management roles at a faster rate than men, indicating that in 2 decades, we could have equal representation in full-time management positions. But for CEO roles, it is predicted that there will not be equal representation for another 80 years. Why don't we have women in these roles? It's widely known that diversity in leadership improves the performance of organisations, including their bottom line. In 2020, the WGEA series discovered more women in key decision-making positions delivers better company performance, greater productivity, and profitability. It adds a market value of $52 to $70 million per year for an average size company. If we compare myself to a 25-year-old woman living in a metropolitan area, the opportunities they have are twofold. Women living in these metropolitan areas have access to technology, networking and conference opportunities, corporate roles and workshops, and even training. I studied my bachelor's degree online. I'm currently doing my postgraduate studies online. If I wanted to attend a conference to connect with other like-minded people, I would need to at least catch one flight or drive more than 5 hours to attend. The challenges we face as women in rural communities, aiming for leadership or power positions, are more than just distance. There are cultural barriers. Our traditional gender roles remain deeply ingrained in many rural communities, making it difficult for women to step into leadership positions without facing resistance. Access to opportunities. Leadership roles are often filled through informal networks, which have historically favoured men and people in metropolitan areas. It is also known that many opportunities are in these areas, which are unattainable to rural, regional, and remote women. Work-life balance. Women in rural areas often juggle many responsibilities: family, farm work, business, and community commitments, making leadership roles an additional burden or challenge. Financial barriers. Access to funding and resources remains a challenge, particularly for women wanting to start or expand businesses, and a lack of representation. When women don't see people like themselves in leadership, it can be harder to envision their own potential in these roles. If women had equal access to resources, their businesses would be more productive and they would be able to feed more hungry people. When women earn an income, they invest in their families, who then become healthier and more educated, which in turn leads to greater prosperity for their communities. Robert Alders. I was born and raised in a rural community in Australia. I work in a male-dominated industry. My clients are nearly all male. My colleagues are also nearly all male. I was selected recently to be a part of a leadership program where I was thrilled to be in a cohort of women, where we were informed that sponsors were disappointed because there were no males, even though the cohort of women were all fairly selected based on criteria. Keep in mind that these were all rural women from all across Australia. We have the chance to create equal opportunities for women like myself, women like those speaking today, who love their communities but dream of a role in power. We are fortunate to have the support of many industry and government groups that are helping us make change. We are seeing more mentorship and support networks created for rural women, programs such as diversity in agriculture. There has been policy and legislative change that addresses systemic barriers, promoting gender-responsive budgeting and ensuring equitable access to resources and opportunities, which includes land, technology, and education. And we are fortunate that in some areas we do have access to digital and technology so that rural women can still have corporate roles in the middle of Australia. I know we can still do better. Implementing further policies which can encourage more businesses to look rural and offer working from home arrangements with the women who have so much to offer, or potentially using blind job applications where only someone's skill set and suitability is taken into consideration, not their location or their gender. When women have a seat at the table, decisions are more inclusive, communities thrive, and industries innovate. Women bring different perspectives, prioritize social and economic sustainability, and foster stronger community engagement. Rural women make up a substantial proportion of the women in Australia, from 18 to 80. Yet there are still more women of working age in major cities employed in professional, scientific, or technical services. The art of effective communication, empathy, and self-awareness are navigation tools that guide women leaders to success. The Women Leaders magazine shows that CEOs who score highly for these traits generally have a much higher return on assets. We excel as rural women in conflict management, flexibility, and teamwork, allowing us to nurture a collaborative team. Organisations must embrace flexibility and remote work options, granting rural women control and opportunities. Women are the roots of our communities. If the roots are strong, the community is strong. Women in power and decision-making roles are shaping the future of rural and regional Australia. There is work to be done, but with determination, support, and action, we can break barriers and create lasting change. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm happy to take questions at the end. I will now pass on to Claire, who will continue this discussion with women and the environment.
Thank you. Wow. Some very tough acts to follow. Hi, everybody. My name is Claire. I am part of the Australian delegation here at CSW, but in my day job, I represent Women with Disabilities Australia. I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on here in New York, the Lenape people, whose lands were called Mannahatta, which is now Manhattan, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations community that have joined us on the call today. So today I'm going to be highlighting the critical issue of climate change and its impact on women and women in rural and regional Australia. These are women who are not just victims of environmental degradation, but they're also leaders in resilience and adaptation. But we know that their experiences are being compounded by intersectional marginalisation as well, which makes the challenges, even more daunting. So climate change, we know it's already here. It's already profoundly impacting rural and regional Australia, with increased heat waves and droughts and more severe weather events across the whole country. Women in these areas are often central to the social and economic fabric of their communities, but they face some unique vulnerabilities due to limited access to things like resources and actually being at those tables, as previous speakers have said. So they lack access to decision-making power. We have the research. We know that gender is a critical factor in vulnerability to climate events, particularly due to the gendered nature of labour in agricultural business and in rural communities. In Australia, those impacts of climate change are amplified for women in rural areas because of their roles, additional roles in managing households and ensuring food security. As primary caregivers, they're responsible for securing food for their families, and a task that can become increasingly difficult with climate-related resource scarcity. I had a conversation with someone today who said, well, no, you wouldn't have resource scarcity, but I think you would see by the map that some of the previous speakers have presented, we have what I consider a poorly developed infrastructure that might rely on one main road or one train track, one store in a community. So resources are not always available at the tip of our fingers in rural areas. This amplification impacts physical and mental health and increases vulnerability to economic instability and also gender-based violence. And I think it's really important to understand the intersectional nature of these challenges. Women from Indigenous backgrounds living in rural areas, and I want to quote the work of Vanessa Kavanagh, who works on Aboriginal cultural burning practices. We know that women in these situations face additional barriers due to cultural and linguistic differences, and also the very patriarchal nature of some of the systems that are in place to mitigate at the moment. We know that these women may have limited access to information about climate change mitigation practices, or actually face discrimination in accessing resources and services. And I think the intersectionality is a really important part of this conversation. To me, it's crucial in understanding how climate change actually affects women differently based on their socio, economic, or cultural factors or identities. For instance, older women in some communities may face greater challenges due to limited mobility or a lack of access to support networks. They're not just affected by climate change, but they're also marginalised by societal norms that restrict their autonomy and opportunities. Having an intersectional lens in this case also highlights the experiences of the women that I work with and the community I belong to, which is women with disabilities who live in rural Australia. These women face additional barriers in accessing information, resources, and services during climate-related emergencies, and also in the preparing for and recovering from those events. We need to ensure that climate policies are actually inclusive of all women and including women with disabilities if we want to build resilient communities. And that includes providing access to accessible communication and adaptive technologies and infrastructure that will support their participation in climate adaptation efforts. And lastly, if we talk about talking about intersectionality, we know that it underscores we know that having a lens that is intersectional shows us the importance of addressing economic marginalisation. Women in rural areas often can have limited access to financial services, which makes it difficult for them to invest in climate-related or climate-resilient practices, or recover from any climate-related losses. In some parts of the world, microfinance programs and economic empowerment initiatives that can help women bridge this gap are not available. So we need to make sure that they can actually access these programs to give them the financial tools that they need to adapt to climate change. And in Australia, we know that it is rural women who are disproportionately affected by climate change. That intensify their exposure to climate-induced stresses. Droughts and floods can force them to travel further for resources and increase their workload and vulnerability to gender-based violence, as well as just increasing, their financial instability and a whole host of other things. Sorry, I lost my place there. It's quite noisy where I am, and I do apologise. We know that these women are more susceptible to economic abuse and exploitation also, which further entrenches their marginalisation. But the experiences of the young women that you've heard today and young women that I've met across Australia also talk to me about their resilience and their adaptability. Despite the challenges that many women face, we know that they have been responsible for adopting innovative strategies to cope with climate change. I've met someone just last week who was talking to me about how they're diversifying their income sources by engaging in non-agricultural activities in an area where they live, which is hit by drought. And she talked to me about how that effort is often hampered by the lack of support and resources. And it is imperative that climate policies address the specific needs of rural women to give them equal access to the things that they need to begin climate adaptation. We talk a lot about, in this space that I'm in today, we've been talking a lot about economic empowerment. This empowering rural women is actually not just a matter of gender equality. It's actually essential when we talk about building resilient communities. We have to involve women in decision-making processes, and they're not there in Australia at the moment. We need to provide them with resources and education and training. We need to give them equal access to healthcare and education and economic opportunities. If we do that, we actually are able to begin working on and promoting climate smart farming and sustainable land management practices. Women's participation in adaptation strategies is actually crucial. It's not a nice to have, it's crucial because they often are the holders of valuable local knowledge that can inform context-specific solutions. The word empowerment gets thrown around a lot, particularly in spaces like CSW. To me, it's actually a critical strategy for addressing the impacts of climate change in Australia. We have to support rural women's economic empowerment. We have to enhance their ability to adapt to environmental changes. That includes providing access to financial services, but it's also about promoting their participation in activities beyond agriculture, like the workforce, like remote workforces, as previous speakers have said. We have to support women to gain access to training programs in entrepreneurship, help them start small business, diversify their income sources, and reduce their reliance on climate sensitive sectors. It's also if we really want to get serious about empowerment, it's about ensuring that women have a voice in decision-making processes at all levels: community, local government, state government, and federal government. We have to do that so that we can support their participation, and not just in an advisory way, in an actual impacting decision way, making sure that they actually have the ability to impact the decisions made for their area and that will impact them. Their involvement in planning and implementing adaptation strategies will lead to more effective and sustainable solutions. We know that. The research is already there. Also, empowering rural women addresses some social and cultural barriers that limit their opportunities. So if we can challenge the gender norms that restrict women's roles and promote education and awareness about gender equality, we can build a culture of inclusivity and respect, and we can create environments where women feel empowered to take leadership roles in climate action. We know that rural women have a lot of success, as I've said, about, in diversifying the impact diversifying the income sources. But we know that those efforts have been hampered by the lack of support and resources available to them. I think, as not many people are aware of just how big Australia is and the distances that women have to travel on top of everything else to get access to the things that I, who live in a metro city now, can, just go and grab off the shelf. So we need to recognise that, and we need to tailor the resources that are made available to suit that. We need to make sure that any climate policies address the specific needs of rural women and make sure that they have equal access to healthcare and education and economic opportunities. Any adaptation strategies have to focus on building resilience at the community level. We have to make sure that we are supporting rural women in community-based initiatives that enhance the climate resilience, such as improving, for example, water harvesting systems, or implementing early warning systems for extreme events. Our participation in these initiatives, or rural women's, participation in these initiatives, is crucial because they are often the knowledge holders of community. They know who is who in their local communities. They are the ones who gather the community groups, who are convening the community groups. So they need to be involved in those decision-making or community resilience activities, because they give insights into community needs, ensure that any solutions that are developed are context-specific and effective, and not being decided upon by a group of often men in a large city who don't have the lived experience of what it is like to live in those communities. I think it's important to recognise too that technology has a really important part to play here, and any adaptation strategies have to leverage technologies to support rural women. This includes providing access to climate information services, of course, such as weather forecasts and early warning systems, which can help women make informed decisions about the work that they do. Now, as you've heard from previous speakers, the communication infrastructure in Australia is in dire need of development. So we need to make sure that we create access to reliable digital platforms on communication networks that support women to connect with markets and information and supports and services. This could enable them to sell their products or access work opportunities more effectively, and that includes even accessing health and wellbeing, mental health services, and financial services. So, in conclusion, for my part today, I want to just recognise that the experiences of rural women in rural and regional Australia, as the face of climate change, they're the face of climate change. They're going to bear the biggest impacts, to my thinking. They're marked by resilience and challenges. I think it's our responsibility to recognise their contributions and empower them to lead climate action. If we do that and we address intersectional marginalisation and we build and support gender-sensitive policies, we can build a more sustainable future for everyone. But we have to work together to ensure that these women are not just survivors of climate change, but leaders in its mitigation. We hear a lot about empowering rural women in climate change or in any spaces really as a sort of, it feels like it's viewed as a moral imperative, but it's not, it's more than that. It's actually a strategic necessity if we want to successfully address climate change. If we support rural women in economic empowerment, in social inclusion, and even political participation, we can unlock their potential as agents of change. And that brings a lot to everyone. That includes recognizing the value of their knowledge and experiences and equipping them with the resources and opportunities that they need to challenge those systemic barriers that limit their opportunities. Ultimately, the success of climate action depends on our ability to address the needs and aspirations of rural women in Australia if we want to build resilient communities that are better equipped to face the challenges of climate change and the environment. We have to support, we have to elevate, and we have to give rural women voices at the table. And we have to resource them. It's not enough to offer an opportunity to someone without providing them the means of attending, of participating. It is imperative that we amplify their voices together and we support their initiatives, ensure that their contributions are recognised and valued. If we can, that's how we get to a more sustainable world for everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to pass over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Claire, for that great speech. That was really, really wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honour to be able to address you at this UN Parallel event on behalf of young women from regional, rural and remote Australia. Education is the most powerful tool that we have to transform lives. Yet for too many rural, regional and remote women, it remains just out of reach. While we as an international community have made significant progress when it comes to expanding access and funding for educational equity along gendered lines, the role of geography as a key intersectional factor in shaping our fundamental right to quality education remains largely overlooked in policy dialogue. The fact of the matter is, we still have a long way to go when it comes to formulating inclusive, targeted and regionally responsive education policies for women residing in non-metropolitan areas. Today, I want to address the barriers that prevent women in rural and remote communities from accessing education and vocational training, and more importantly, the solutions that exist that we can implement to begin to change this reality. By harnessing digital technology and AI, strengthening community-based education programs, expanding scholarships and mentorship opportunities, and reforming vocational training policies, we can make tangible strides towards a future where every woman, no matter where she lives, has the chance to learn, thrive, and lead. Rural and regional women face a unique set of challenges when it comes to accessing education and training. Distance, financial hardship, caregiving responsibilities, and outdated educational structures all contribute to this inequity. Many are forced to abandon their aspirations due to a lack of local educational facilities or spaces in tertiary courses, unreliable internet access, or the rigid nature of traditional learning models. Cultural and societal expectations also play a role, often placing significant domestic responsibilities above education for women in these communities. Limited transportation options make it difficult to attend classes, while the high costs associated with travel, tuition, and study material create even further obstacles. Additionally, a lack of female role models and mentors in rural areas can discourage young women from pursuing higher education or vocational training. Addressing these barriers requires a comprehensive and multifaceted approach that ensures rural women have both the resources and the encouragement needed to pursue their educational goals. Without intervention, these barriers don't just impact us as individuals, they can begin to shape entire communities, limiting economic growth and social mobility. 2016 research from Universities Australia shows that every university graduate entering the workforce increases Australian GDP on average by $124,000, and that a 10% rise in educational attainment in regional, rural, and remote Australia corresponds to a 2.5% increase in local GDP. But the good news is that change is possible with the right policy measures. The rise of digital learning offers an unprecedented opportunity to bring education directly to rural women. By leveraging online platforms, hybrid learning models, and mobile-friendly courses, we can provide flexible, high-quality education tailored to the realities of rural life. We must acknowledge, however, that access to digital technology alone does not automatically guarantee educational equity. Governments and private companies must invest not only in infrastructure, but also in digital literacy programs to ensure that rural women can fully benefit from online education. The technology needs to be more than just available, it needs to be usable. For example, community-driven digital literacy workshops in rural areas can help women become more confident in using digital tools, ensuring that they can effectively navigate online courses and resources. As a result, these women can take advantage of educational opportunities that technology offers without the added anxiety of feeling technologically illiterate. The more we invest in these skills, the more we empower rural and regional women to not only access education, but to take ownership of it. Beyond digital solutions, we must also invest in local, community-driven educational initiatives. Programs such as skill-building workshops, adult education classes, and literacy campaigns can provide immediate and practical benefits. Imagine a network of local learning hubs where women can come together to study, access mentors, and gain industry-relevant skills. These centres could offer free courses in agriculture, healthcare, small business management, and technology, empowering women with the tools they need to build careers and contribute meaningfully to their local communities. Collaboration with local leaders is also essential. When education becomes embedded within a community, it becomes more accessible, culturally sensitive, and sustainable. Another critical piece of the puzzle is financial support. Too often, women from regional, rural, and remote backgrounds are unable to continue their education simply because they cannot afford it. Scholarships, grants, and sponsorships must be expanded to specifically target rural learners. Equally important is the aspect of mentorship. Education is not just about knowledge, it's about guidance, support, and networks. Partnering with governments, businesses, and nonprofits to establish mentorship programs can provide rural women with the encouragement and professional connections they need to succeed. The power of mentorship is not just in the advice that's offered, but the belief it instills. In rural communities where networks can often be limited, a mentor can become a lifeline. Programs that pair young rural women with mentors from similar backgrounds can build strong relationships of trust, which are essential in guiding them through the often challenging journey of education and future career building. One great example of a mentorship program would be one that pairs rural women with female professionals in their chosen field, offering career advice, skill development, and the motivation to persevere. The impact of such programs is profound. Not only do they help individual women thrive, but they also create a ripple effect to inspire future generations. While digital learning offers one avenue, vocational education remains a critical part of the pathway to sustainable employment for rural women. However, vocational programs in Australia, as they currently stand, are often unable to cater to the specific needs of rural learners. It's time for vocational education institutions to evolve, creating hybrid learning models that combine flexible online coursework with in-person solutions to specifically tailor their work to regional and remote communities. This would allow women to complete qualifications without uprooting their lives or leaving behind caregiving responsibilities. Reforming minimum course attendance requirements and ensuring that remote learners have access to flexible scheduling and financial assistance would significantly increase participation rates. With these changes, vocational training can become a true pathway to economic independence for rural women. As we gather here virtually today, we have the opportunity to take bold action. It's not enough to simply acknowledge the barriers that rural women face. We need to commit to a vision where education, regardless of location, is accessible to all women. This means championing the digital revolution in education, investing in community-driven learning initiatives, and providing robust financial and mentoring support to ensure that rural, regional, and remote women can reach their full potential. We need to create policies that directly address the unique challenges faced by women in rural communities, ensuring that educational institutions cater to their needs. This requires us to look beyond traditional models of education and begin to embrace innovation, flexibility, and inclusivity. Our call to action at the 69th UN Commission on the Status of Women is clear. Let's unite as an international community to make education a reality for every woman, no matter where she lives. When we invest in the education of rural, regional, and remote women, we unlock untapped potential. And when we support these women to become leaders in their communities, we build a stronger, more equitable world. Thank you. I will now pass on to Sarah, who will be discussing women and violence.
Thank you, Phoebe. Hard act to follow. I'm Sarah. I'm a family domestic violence specialist based in rural Australia. I was born rural, moved over to Western Australia and live in a very remote community. I come from an agricultural background, but I'm now in a very different version of rurality. Prior to speaking, I am going to advise that it is going to be about violence against women, and I am going to share a young woman's story in detail. She's a victim survivor. So I will offer the opportunity to mute or leave this conversation for the next 15 minutes or so. When we reflect upon how violence against women impacts on victim survivors' lives, it is intrinsically linked with the 11 other areas of concern. Until we have equity for women in all these priority areas, we are unable to reduce, prevent, and ultimately stop violence against women. Violence against women impacts on women and children in a vast number of ways, such as sexual violence, family violence, systematic rape during wartime, child trafficking, sex trafficking, female genital mutilation, child marriage, and forced marriages to legalize rape. This is a non-exhaustive list of ways women and children are harmed under the umbrella term of violence against women. I will be focusing primarily on family, domestic, and sexual violence. For the purpose of this, I will call it domestic violence. I want to share the story of Bella. Bella's not her real name, but this is a very real story. Bella is a young lady who had been sexually assaulted by a young man known to her. This man was supposedly her friend. Bella had just entered her 20s when she reached my service. Bella was a happy girl prior to her assault. She had a great family life. She had a mental health diagnosis, which was not curable, but managed. However, it did inhibit some aspects of her life. She had no access to services in town or her closest centre to manage the symptoms of her diagnosis. She was sexually assaulted one night in a dark park with no lights. She had no option but to get back in the car with her assaulter and be dropped back off to where she was staying. Bella was lucky to be surrounded by supportive friends and family who took her to the hospital immediately after she was assaulted. When she got back to the hospital well after midnight, she was told there was no forensic kit or skilled practitioners to conduct the procedure. She was told to go home, a 45-minute drive from the hospital, and she was told to wait. She could not shower. She was still wearing the now damaged clothing and soiled underwear she was sexually assaulted in. She physically fought with her family in a bid to have a shower. She waited for 14 hours until she was told they were ready to see her. She returned to the hospital. She completed her sexual assault testing and she provided a statement to the police. She was sent home with no supports. Bella received no supports for her mental health, not through lack of trying. The assault made her once manageable mental health spiral into a series of attempts to die by suicide and a stay at a mental health facility over 1,500 kilometres away from her hometown and her family. She lost her job and her traineeship. She never completed high school. One particularly hard night, Bella had a mental health crisis, and when she woke in the back of an ambulance with two strangers, she panicked and assaulted one of them. She was charged with assaulting a public officer. In my state, this carries a prison sentence. Bella was brave and she followed through the court processes and even supplied a testimony in court. Her assaulter was convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to prison. A rumour, made up by someone in town, was formally reported to the police, and her assaulter was released after serving less than a sixth of his sentence. The matter was listed for retrial. Bella was referred to me by her government-funded lawyer for support because there were no other sexual assault supports close to her. I had to breach my funding contract to work with this victim. It was not a hard choice. It was hardly even a choice to work with her. This was a young girl and a family who were lost in the system. She prepared for the retrial, which was not easy, and she tried on multiple occasions to drop the charges. The strength of her family was what kept her pushing through. She went to trial, and I watched her get questioned and attempt to disprove rumours that were victim-blaming in nature. Her sexual history was brought into question. It was in a courtroom that it was raised about a personal image that she shared to someone consensually and privately, and it was illegally spread throughout her school. This image was weaponized against her to call into question her sexuality and looseness of morals. Thankfully, the magistrate did not wait long to find the assaulted guilty. However, due to his time between trials, he was able to start an apprenticeship and an intimate partner relationship with another woman, which apparently testified to his good-natured character. He was sentenced to a shorter term of imprisonment again and served less than half of it before being released on parole for good behaviour. Bella was still facing charges for an assault of a public officer. She unfortunately was convicted, but thankfully she was linked with services that were able to help prove to the court the sexual assault was the cause of her actions. When the assaulter was released to return to the community in which Bella was trying to live between mental health crises and horrid rumours, her family had lived in this town for many decades and they were forced out because he was allowed to come back. Since this time, she's not gotten better. She's still struggling to hold down jobs. She's struggling to manage her mental health and even build relationships with other people. Bella has a really long road ahead of her in a system that continues to fail her. Bella was lucky though. Bella was supported by her family, she was believed by the police, and she was believed by the court system. She was able to access services, and not so many are like her. So how does Bella's story and so many like her intersect with the priority actions? Human rights. In Australia, we have at least 20 documents, strategies and plans determining the desperate need to reduce domestic violence in our nation. These are guided by the ratification of international documents and conventions that call domestic violence and violence against women a breach of human rights. If women and girls have the right to live free from harm, how come over 30% of the domestic violence and health? Women in rural areas already experience lower health quality across a range of health matters compared to their metropolitan counterparts. Complex and interrelated reasons for this lower health includes, but it's not limited to, lower socioeconomic levels, environmental and occupational exposures such as drought, dust and sun exposure, poorer access to health services such as distance to services and greater out-of-pocket expenses, and less effective health services, including hospital with poorer facilities and less experienced doctors. Researcher Kate Fitzgibbon wrote that domestic violence is the cause for more death, disease and disability and illness for women aged 15 to 44 than any other preventable risk factor. In 2022 and 23, women in very remote communities had higher rates of hospitalisation, about 50 times higher than those living in regional or major cities. Bella's case highlights the intrinsic issue with the rural health system, such as the lack of resources readily available for crisis and the lack of mental health services from affordable psychologists through to critical care facilities like mental health facilities. By increasing quality health services that equitably support rural women, we provide victims, but also for rural women overall. All health and medical services should be free and more readily accessible across rural Australia. Governments should ensure health clinics always have sexual assault testing kits and the relevant practitioners available. And governments should reduce the cost of healthcare and fund travel to and from services when one is not locally available. Women, the economy, education, training, and decision-making positions. I've united these three criteria or concerns, not because I believe they should be merged into one, but because research and policy that appropriately considers how they intersect with rurality and FDV is really limited. Coming back to Bella's story, we look at the ongoing impacts of the experience of sexual violence. Due to her trauma, she was unable to return to work, and when she finally did, she struggled and ended up terminating her traineeship. Women who have experienced domestic violence are 5 times more likely to not be in employment. This is even higher for victims experiencing or who have experienced financial abuse. Further, when women gain employment, this does not reduce the level of abuse they experience. A 2021 study shows that when gender pay parity occurs, or when the woman in the relationship earns more than half the household income, both physical and emotional abuse increase. Drawing from Hayley's discussion earlier, we are aware women make up 32% of the agricultural workforce in Australia, but only make up 23% of leadership roles. Women consistently hold positions of lower decision-making, management, and leadership. We also know that rural women have a valuable role in the Australian economy, as Natalie showed, about $60 billion worth of value. Governments need to implement mechanisms, systems, and policies that continue to advance gender equality and support for women's financial freedom and understand the powerful role that rural women have in our economy. Institutional mechanisms. Bella's matter was listed for retrial due to a rumour, and a private image was weaponised against her in court. This highly regarded justice institution replicates the disbelief of women and girls' experiences of domestic violence. It reinforces victim-blaming behaviour. Luckily for Bella, she was believed and he was convicted. Many women do not even report their experience of violence, as they believe the justice system will not support them. And to some degree, that's accurate. The fact that the assaulter had good character, because he was able to start a traineeship and start a new intimate relationship, continues to blame the victim for the assault, and even suggests that the victim caused the fault in his good nature. In New South Wales, a campaign for the removal of character references from child sexual assault cases is in action. However, one Australian State Bar Association claims the removal of the character reference is anti-ethical to principles of proportionality and balance in the sentencing process, meaning that it would be unfair to not allow assaulters' friends and families to be allowed to endorse the assaulter in court. Until we have greater representation of women in institutions at all levels, from local government through to federal, more women in the judiciary, and more women in public service, we will continue to replicate institutions that are founded on patriarchy. Women and the environment. There are so many amazing ways women engage with the land around them, from farming and aquaculture, wildlife and land care ranges, and so many more. However, women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Focusing on violence after a natural disaster exemplifies how women are connected to the environment for good or bad. After a natural disaster, study after study shows that domestic violence increases. From the 1993 Missouri River flood, demand from women's shelter increased by 400%. And after Hurricane Katrina, domestic violence quadrupled. This has continued to be reflected in studies across Australia and New Zealand. Some explanations for the increase in violence include the immense pressure to re-establish lives, homelessness, unemployment, and increased alcohol and drug use, and the traumatic disaster experience that challenges the male's sense of self and their safety in the world. The 2009 Black Saturday fires in Australia made it impossible for men to feel like they could live up to society's demands for masculinity and adequacy. It's heartbreaking to see the relationship between men and their construction of gender norms being severed due to natural disaster, and the belief that the only way to retain masculine status is to fall into violence and abuse. Policies that keep women and children visible during disasters is imperative. This includes the preparation for natural disasters like cyclones, during disasters like bushfires and floods, and during the recovery of disaster areas. Having women in emergency management positions and in policy and decision-making positions would increase the safety of women in these traumatic times. Women and poverty. In 2022, researcher Anne Summers released a report entitled The Choice, Violence or Poverty. The report that found that women who are forced to choose between staying in a domestic abuse relationship or leaving it and entering poverty, with over half of women who left domestic violence relationships entered into poverty. Women in rural areas have lower socioeconomic levels and can be financially dependent on their partners, such as having complex property and asset arrangements, unemployment, or not having an income to support their family. In my region, a family home with 3 bedrooms is renting for over $1,500 a week. A woman working in full-time employment makes an average weekly income of $1,270. When women report Many women report staying in a relationship because they can't afford to leave. And 15% of women who do leave return to the domestic abuse because it's better than poverty. There is a significant lack of research and policy that focuses on the unique experiences of rural women. And they are listed with other vulnerable people, such as LGBTIQ+, Indigenous women, culturally and linguistically diverse women, and women with disability. Each of these groups experiences their own unique interactions between each other and with rurality, and they cannot be adequately supported by lumping these vulnerable groups together. There needs to be specific policies for rural women to leave domestic violence relationships and access a range of economic supports to do so. Women and the media. Rural women, FDV, and the media has proven to be extremely difficult to research. There are many criminological and sociological theories around representation of victims in the media and what the ideal perfect victim is. This perfect victim is a woman from a middle-class white background who suffered a particularly heinous crime. Therefore, Indigenous women, women from multicultural backgrounds, especially international students, rural women, and other vulnerable groups are less likely to be represented in the media. On the 9th of February, an Indigenous woman from very remote Australia was found deceased and her ex-partner was charged. I found 2 news articles on her. A comment at the bottom of one of these articles announced the death of another rural Indigenous woman due to domestic violence. Both of these women remain nameless. I could not find any further information on these women. We need fair representation of women in the media and greater representation of violence against women that accurately portrays the real experiences of women who have suffered and/or have died due to domestic violence. The media plays a really critical role in genuinely challenging gender norms and criticising the normalisation of violence against women. I've chosen not to discuss the girl child and women and conflict. I've chosen this because these are 2 issues that are too important to summarise. In summary of what I have spoken about, I've touched on 10 of these critical areas to highlight how domestic violence impacts on every facet of a victim's life. And until we have women's equality, we will not be able to stop violence against women. Thank you. And I'm going to throw it back to Lauren.
Hello, thanks so much for that. Now we have a little bit of time for a question or 2. So please, if you have any questions for any of the presenters today, can you please chuck them into the chat? Okay, well, no questions so far. I will read out one that we have prepared earlier. So for Nat, Phoebe, and Haley, in leadership and in the workforce, continued access to education is important. How can this be achieved for women when living in rural Australia?
Yeah, Lauren, I'm happy to jump in on this one. I think, like I said in my presentation and also mirrored in the others, access is the beginning of the issue. So without being actually able to access any education because you have no mobile or internet service, then you can't possibly start to actually engage in those opportunities. And then to Phoebe's point around literacy, sure, you might then be able to access it, but can you actually meaningfully engage in it and learn from it? So I think it's a lot about actually looking into what's available from these institutions and the way that they're structured to identify if they really are inclusive for everyone, or perhaps maybe just be very popular amongst a subset of students.
Thanks, Natalie. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I'm happy to jump in on that point as well. I think access is, like Natalie said, the beginning of the issue. And I think it has to be, especially when it comes to conversations around digital technology for education, there has to be both an accessible lens applied, but also the technology must be usable, which means we need to address digital literacy in communities that are, residing outside of metropolitan areas. I think as well, another, quite pressing issue is definitely the idea of affordable education. I think while some education courses are certainly free at this stage, I think there are many that still require women to spend quite a lot of money and are not subsidized. And I think the more we make access to education significantly less financially onerous on certain women and certain communities, I think that way we're able to really start to bridge that divide.
Thanks, Phoebe. It's almost time to wrap up now. So, Claire, do you have any final comments before we finish?
Yeah, I do. So thank you very much for having me, everyone. I've actually learned quite a bit, which is fantastic. I think I just really want to emphasize that the importance and the role that women in rural areas have in mitigation of climate change. It's here, it's real, and I also just wanted to address one particular um, idea that seems to be pervasive, and I'm just reflecting on Sarah's comments on the media. There's this idea, I think, that disasters are this kind of standalone thing, that it's a one-time thing, or you hear this once in 100 years. Well, once in 100 years seems to be every year at the moment, and I think I just wanted to say that on that particular subject, the disasters are here. They're increasing in frequency, the duration, the amount of time it's taking to recover, and they're all of the time, right? There's not just these big flood events there, or these big fire events. It's things like where you've had way more rainfall than you had, that the Australian soil is used to, and the soil is retaining the water so that the plants and the agriculture, the farms are not able to grow the crops in an effective way. Or the reverse is true. The soil is so dry, there's a drought, it's ongoing. So I think it's really important to just recognize that these are not one-off disasters that the Australian community or the Australian landscape is facing. These are continually consistent and quite devastating, but they're not always the big events that hit the media. Heat waves, we call them a silent killer. They're not silent. They're just not being attributed to the deaths of people in the way that they should be. Anyway, so what I want to finish up on is that it is imperative that we involve rural women at those decision-making tables, that we resource them to get to the decision-making tables. Don't offer a seat at a table that's 2,000 kilometres of travel and worrying about childcare and time away from the farm so that someone else has to be paid to take her place. That's not equitable access. So I want the decision makers to offer the positions at the table, but think about what it takes to resource the women to get there and make that possible, right? And value their lived experience and their local knowledge, and help and give them the opportunity to be the designers of the mitigation policies, the recovery, the planning that will suit their communities. I spend a lot of time talking about disaster management, and too often I see this one-size-fits-all approach to funding, to resourcing, to the program or the plan or whatever it is, that is, to be fairly blunt, designed by a bunch of people living in a city location who actually don't know what it's like to live on the land. And I'm really, really, you'll never convince me otherwise that that's going to work, right? So we need to give women the opportunity to say what is going to work for their community and give them the resources to do it. And honestly, get out of the way and let them do it, right? Because no one is more driven to make resilient communities than the women who are living in them. And I will get off my soapbox and let someone else have a say. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire, for all your valuable insights today. So thank you for everyone for joining the National Rural Women's Coalition's Young, Rural, Regional and Remote Women's Advocacy Panels discussion today. If you want to keep in contact with us, please follow us on our socials or visit our website shown on the screen. Thanks so much and have a good rest of your days.